Imagine a freezing night in Yellowstone National Park. 3 newborn babies, helpless, abandoned by their own father, left to die in the wilderness. But then, something unbelievable happens. A lone tigress emerges from the shadows. She could attack, but instead, she does the unthinkable. She decides to protect them. But how can a fierce predator become a mother? And what happens when the village hunters find out what she's done? Stay until the end. This story will surprise you. Now, comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. The bitter cold of a Wyoming winter blanketed Yellowstone National Park with a thick layer of snow, muffling every sound except for the distant howling of wolves. The towering pines swayed under the weight of ice, their branches bending as if mourning something unseen. Beneath this vast expanse of wilderness, hidden from the eyes of civilization, a man named Ethan Carter stood trembling in the dead of night. His breath came out in ragged puffs, mixing with the fog rolling off the frozen ground. His face, sharp with exhaustion and hollowed by grief, was barely illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the dense trees. His clothes, once clean and sturdy, were now soaked, clinging to his shivering frame. In his arms, he held 3 newborns, swaddled in a thin, tattered blanket. Their fragile cries pierced the silence of the woods, desperate, unaware of the cruel fate awaiting them. Ethan clenched his jaw, his hands gripping the bundle tightly. His wife, Lena, had died hours ago, blood staining the floor of their small cabin on the outskirts of Gardner, the town closest to Yellowstone. The childbirth had been too much for her body. He had tried, oh, how he had tried, to save her. But there had been no doctor, no midwife, only his trembling hands pressing against her lifeless form as the newborns wailed beside her. "She's gone," he whispered hoarsely, his throat raw from screaming, from crying, from the sheer agony that now weighed on his chest like a stone. And now, these babies, his own flesh and blood, were a curse upon him. That's what they said. That's what Reverend Cole, the town's preacher, had whispered in his ear as he stood over Lena's lifeless body. "They were never meant to live, Ethan," the old man had murmured with a look of pity. "Your wife's death was a warning. If you keep them, more suffering will follow. Let nature take its course. God will decide their fate." Ethan had listened, and in his grief-stricken mind, those words took root like a poisonous vine. He had wrapped the infants in a thin blanket, held them close, and walked deep into the forest, far beyond the reach of the town, far enough that no one would hear them cry. Now, standing in the snow-covered clearing, his legs shaking, he forced himself to believe he was doing the right thing. "You won't suffer," he murmured, kneeling carefully as he placed the bundle down onto the cold, hard earth. His fingers brushed against the delicate cheeks of his daughter, then his sons, Jake, Emily, and Noah. They were innocent. They didn't deserve this. And yet, Ethan took a step back, then another. The wind howled through the trees, wrapping around him like an icy embrace. He clenched his fists, his breathing uneven. He had to go. But then, a sound. A low, guttural growl. Ethan froze. His pulse pounded in his ears as he turned his head slowly toward the darkness beyond the trees. A shadow moved, a shape, large and deliberate, slinking between the trunks. A predator. His breath hitched. A wolf? A bear? He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the dim moonlight, and then he saw it, a tiger. His heart nearly stopped. Impossible. There were no tigers in Yellowstone. And yet, there she was. The massive cat stepped forward, her orange and black striped coat almost ghostly in the pale light. Her green eyes locked onto his, unblinking, intelligent, assessing. Snowflakes clung to her fur as she moved closer, silent despite her enormous size. Ethan stumbled back, his instinct screaming at him to run, but his body refused to obey. The tiger was inches from the babies now, her head lowering as she sniffed them. The infants whimpered, their tiny bodies trembling against the cold. The tiger, Savannah, exhaled a breath so warm that it sent a wisp of steam into the frigid air. Ethan swallowed hard, watching as the predator nudged one of the babies gently with her nose. Not a sign of aggression, No exposed fangs, no snarling. Just curiosity. His body trembled violently. Was this a sign? Would the tiger do what he couldn't? Ethan's vision blurred with tears. He turned on his heel and fled, crashing through the snow-covered underbrush, never looking back. His footsteps faded into the howling wind, swallowed by the night. Behind him, Savannah lifted her head, watching the man disappear into the darkness. And then, she turned back to the babies, her green eyes flickering with something ancient, something primal. A decision had been made. She would protect them. The icy wind swept through the trees of Yellowstone National Park, carrying with it the scent of fresh snow and the distant rustling of nocturnal creatures. Savannah, the Bengal tigress, stood motionless in the dim moonlight, her breath visible in the freezing air. Her powerful muscles tensed beneath her thick coat as she took another cautious step toward the three tiny figures lying in the snow. The infants were shivering, their fragile bodies barely wrapped in the thin blanket. Their tiny cries, weak and uneven, barely reached beyond the clearing. Savannah's ears flicked, her sharp instincts urging her to assess the situation. She had never encountered something like this before. The forests of Yellowstone were filled with elk, bison, and the occasional lone wolf. But human cubs? This was new. She sniffed the air again, her long whiskers twitching. There was no sign of their mother, only the fading scent of the man who had left them behind, a scent laced with fear, grief, and something darker. Savannah let out a low, throaty sound, almost like a hum, before lowering her head closer to the infants. The girl, the smallest of the three, let out a soft whimper, her tiny hand twitching as if reaching for warmth that wasn't there. Something inside Savannah stirred. For years, she had wandered alone. She had known the weight of loss. She had once had cubs of her own, but they were gone now, stolen from her by poachers before she was brought to Yellowstone. Though she had been released into the wild, her instincts to nurture, to protect, had never faded. And now, three helpless creatures lay before her, abandoned, vulnerable. Savannah exhaled slowly, her massive paws crunching against the snow as she circled the babies. They wouldn't survive the night. Her muscles coiled as she crouched down. Carefully, delicately, she took the edge of the blanket in her mouth and lifted them. Their weight was unfamiliar, different from the warm, wriggling bodies of her lost cubs, but she adjusted. The wind howled through the trees, covering her tracks as she moved. She would take them somewhere safe. The cave was hidden deep within the mountains, nestled behind a dense thicket of pine trees. It had been Savannah's refuge for years, a shelter from storms, from hunters, from the dangers lurking in the wild. She padded inside, her eyes adjusting to the darkness as the scent of damp earth and stone surrounded her. She could hear the slow dripping of water somewhere deeper in the cave, the soft flutter of bats overhead. She set the babies down on a patch of dry moss near the back of the cavern, where the cold couldn't reach them as easily. Their cries had softened, but they still trembled, their tiny hands grasping at the empty air. Savannah lowered herself beside them, curling her massive body around them. Warmth. The girl, Emily, stirred first, pressing her tiny face against Savannah's fur. Then, Jake and Noah followed, their small bodies seeking the heat radiating from the tigress. For the first time since their birth, the babies stopped crying. Savannah rested her head on her paws, her emerald eyes watching over them as the wind howled outside. They were safe. For now. Meanwhile, back in the town of Gardner, the lanterns outside Reverend Cole's church flickered against the storm, their dim glow barely reaching the edges of the wooden steps where Ethan sat, his face buried in his hands. "Did you do it?" The Reverend's voice came from the doorway. Ethan lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes staring at the older man. His hands were shaking. "I left them," Ethan whispered, his voice hollow. Reverend Cole stepped forward, his boots crunching against the snow. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes gleamed with something Ethan couldn't quite place. "You did what had to be done," Cole said. "Some burdens are too heavy for a man to carry alone." Ethan clenched his jaw, his body tense. "But they're just babies," he choked out. Cole's expression darkened. He leaned down, his voice barely above a whisper. They were never meant to live. Ethan shuddered. Outside, the wind howled, as if the forest itself knew the truth. And somewhere deep in the wilderness, a tigress watched over the children who had been cast away. The night pressed heavily against the dense forest of Yellowstone National Park, its silence broken only by the distant cry of an owl and the soft rustling of pine trees swaying in the wind. A fresh layer of snow blanketed the ground, absorbing the sounds of the wild, turning the world into an eerie, frozen stillness. Inside the hidden cave nestled between jagged cliffs, Savannah, the tigress, lay curled around the three newborns. Her massive body shielded them from the icy air, her rhythmic breathing creating a steady, comforting warmth. The infants had stopped crying, their tiny bodies, still frail and delicate, pressed against the soft fur of their unlikely guardian. Emily, the smallest, had instinctively nuzzled closer to Savannah's chest, her tiny fingers gripping the tigress's thick fur. Jake and Noah stirred occasionally, their lips parting in weak, reflexive motions, seeking the nourishment they desperately needed. Savannah's emerald eyes remained open, alert. She knew warmth alone wouldn't keep them alive. They needed food. She lifted her head, her ears twitching at the distant howls of wolves marking their territory. She had lived long enough in this wilderness to understand that even predators had rules, unspoken boundaries that determined who lived and who died. She wasn't supposed to intervene, but something deep within her refused to abandon these cubs. She stood slowly, careful not to disturb the babies as she padded toward the entrance of the cave. The snow outside reflected the pale glow of the moon, casting eerie silver streaks across the rocks. Savannah knew she had to move quickly. The small farm on the outskirts of Gardiner, about 10 miles from the forest's edge, a modest farm, stood against the wind, its wooden fence barely visible beneath the layers of snow. A single lantern flickered near the front porch, casting long shadows across the ground. Inside the farmhouse, Clara Evans was stirring a pot of milk on the old stove, her wrinkled hands working methodically despite the late hour. She had been tending to the newborn goats all evening, making sure they had enough warmth in the brutal winter. Her husband, Walter, sat in his rocking chair near the fire, rubbing his temples. "You hear that?" he murmured suddenly. Sitting up, Clara paused, her ears straining against the quiet. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then, a faint rustling. Something moving outside. Walter grabbed his old rifle from the corner, his expression grim. "Could be a wolf," he muttered. "Or a coyote after the livestock." Clara tightened her shawl around her shoulders and stepped closer to the window, her eyes scanning the darkness. The wind howled, rattling the glass. Then she saw them, large paw prints in the snow. But these weren't the delicate tracks of a coyote or the deep marks of a wolf. These were massive, too large for anything native to Yellowstone. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Tiger," she whispered. Walter froze. "What?" She turned to him, her face pale. "Look at the prints. Ain't no wolf got paws that size." Walter exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Ain't supposed to be no tigers here, Clara." "Well, there's one now," she murmured, pulling her coat tighter. Suddenly, the barn door creaked. Walter swung his rifle toward the noise. For a moment, silence. Then, a shadow moved along the wooden beams, slipping between the stalls. The lantern hanging near the entrance swayed slightly, casting eerie, flickering light across the barn floor. And then they saw it. A massive striped figure, moving low to the ground. The tiger. Walter took a step forward, rifle raised, but Clara grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. Walter hesitated, watching as the animal slinked toward the back of the barn. Then, something unexpected. Instead of attacking, instead of lunging toward the livestock, the tiger nudged something with its nose. A wooden crate. Milk. Savannah wasn't hunting. She was stealing. Walter and Clara stood frozen as the great beast used her massive jaws to carefully lift the crate, then turned and disappeared into the night, her striped coat blending with the shadows. The only thing left behind was a trail of paw prints leading back into the forest. Back in the cave, Savannah returned to the cave just before dawn, her powerful limbs moving swiftly despite the weight of the stolen crate. She entered the darkness, her breath coming out in slow, measured puffs. The infants stirred at the scent of fresh milk. With precise movements, Savannah nudged the crate closer to them, her sharp teeth carefully tearing at the wooden edges. The smell of warm milk filled the cave. She couldn't feed them the way their mother would have, but she could provide. She pressed her large, warm body closer to them as they instinctively latched onto the cloth soaked in the milk. It wasn't much, but it would keep them alive. For now, at the farmhouse back at the Evans farm, Clara sat in stunned silence, staring at the snowy footprints that led away from their barn. "A tiger," she murmured again. Walter still held his rifle, but he hadn't fired a shot. He couldn't. She wasn't hunting, he finally admitted, shaking his head. Clara met his eyes. No, she was feeding something. A chill ran down her spine, but not from the cold. Deep in the woods, something wasn't right. And soon, the whole town would know. Dawn broke over the small town of Gardner, Montana, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered streets. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the crisp winter air carried the scent of burning wood and brewing coffee. The town was quiet, save for the occasional barking of dogs or the distant sound of cattle stirring in their pens. But inside the Evans farmhouse, the air was thick with tension. Walter Evans sat at the kitchen table, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, his brows furrowed in deep thought. Across from him, Clara stood near the stove, her arms crossed over her chest. "You gonna tell the others?" she finally asked, her voice quiet. Walter let out a slow breath. "Dunno yet." "Well, they're gonna find out soon enough," Clara muttered, turning to pour herself a cup of coffee. "A tiger roaming this close to town? It ain't exactly something you keep secret." Walter ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind replaying the events of the night before. The paw prints, the crate of milk, the way the animal had moved. Not like a predator hunting, but like a mother providing. That part disturbed him the most. Why would a tiger steal food? It didn't make sense. Unless... Walter set his mug down with a soft thud. "You think she's got cubs?" he asked. Clara turned, her expression unreadable. "I think she's got something," she said. "And whatever it is, she's willing to risk her life for it." A knock at the door interrupted their thoughts. Walter sighed, already knowing who it was. He pushed his chair back and opened the door to find James Caldwell, the town's self-appointed hunter and tracker, standing on the porch with a rifle slung over his shoulder. His thick coat was dusted with snow, and his breath came out in visible puffs. "Heard about your little visitor last night," James said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I assume you saw the tracks?" Walter nodded, closing the door behind him. "Yeah, we saw him." James narrowed his eyes. "You get a good look at it?" Walter hesitated. He didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to paint a target on the tiger's back. "It was big," he admitted. "Definitely a tiger." James scoffed. "No damn tiger belongs in Yellowstone. Someone's got to put it down before it kills one of our livestock. Or worse." Clara frowned. "She didn't kill nothing. She took milk." James snorted. "Milk? What the hell does a tiger want with milk?" Walter and Clara exchanged a glance, but said nothing. James shifted the rifle on his shoulder. "Look, I know you two are soft on animals, but this ain't a stray dog. It's a wild predator, and if we don't take care of it, we'll regret it." Walter sighed. He knew how this town worked. If people felt threatened, they wouldn't wait. They'd act, and that meant the hunt was coming. The town reacts by midday. Word had spread like wildfire. A tiger had been spotted. At Miller's General Store, a small group of townsfolk gathered, their voices overlapping in heated conversation. "I told you something was off in those woods," one man muttered, shaking his head. "How the hell did a tiger get here in the first place?" another asked. "Escaped from some zoo, probably." "Doesn't matter where it came from," James Caldwell interrupted, his voice sharp. "What matters is that it's dangerous, and we don't wait around to see what happens next." The crowd murmured in agreement. "Form a hunting party," someone suggested. "Track it before it disappears again." James smirked. "Already ahead of you." From the corner of the store, Margaret Dawson, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a cane that she rarely needed, watched the commotion in silence. When James finally stepped outside to gather his men, she followed. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Margaret said, her voice calm but firm. James turned, raising a brow. "That's so?" Margaret nodded. "You're assuming this animal is just another predator. But animals don't steal food unless they're starving or feeding something else." James chuckled. "You telling me that tigers got babies?" Margaret didn't blink. "I'm telling you that she's protecting something. And if you kill her without knowing what, you may be making a bigger mistake than you realize." James scoffed and turned away, muttering something under his breath. But Margaret wasn't done. She had seen something like this before, long ago, when she was just a child. A mother wolf had been hunted after killing a deer near the outskirts of town. When the hunters finally tracked her, they found 5 starving pups hidden in the brush, left to die. She still remembered the way those pups cried in the night, their tiny voices swallowed by the wind. And now, all these years later, she had a sinking feeling that history was about to repeat itself. Only this time, the stakes were even higher. Back in the cave far from the chaos of town, Savannah lay curled around the infants, her body shielding them from the cold. They had stopped crying hours ago, their tiny bellies no longer empty. She lifted her head slightly, ears twitching at the distant sound of wolves howling. The forest was waking. She knew that humans would come soon. They always did. And when they did, she would do whatever it took to keep these cubs safe, even if it meant facing death itself. The crisp winter air carried the scent of pine and frost as James Caldwell tightened his grip around the rifle slung over his shoulder. A group of men, armed and determined, gathered near the town's outskirts, their breath rising in the cold morning air. Horses pawed at the snow, snorting with impatience as saddles creaked beneath the weight of their riders. James glanced over his shoulder at the assembled hunting party. 6 men, all experienced outdoorsmen, their expressions ranging from grim determination to quiet unease. Some had hunted wolves and bears before, but a tiger? That was something none of them had ever faced. "All right, listen up," James called, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Tracks lead north toward the old ranger trails. That thing ain't getting far. We track it, find it, and take it down before it kills something, or someone." Walter Evans, standing a few feet away with his rifle resting against his hip, wasn't so sure. He hadn't been able to shake the thought that the tiger wasn't just another predator. It had stolen milk, not meat. It hadn't attacked any livestock or left behind the usual carnage of a wild hunt. But trying to reason with James Caldwell was like trying to stop the river from freezing over in winter. "We shouldn't rush this," Walter said cautiously. "That tiger's been acting strange. We don't know why it's here." James let out a sharp laugh. "What's there to know? It's a goddamn wild animal, Walter. And we kill wild animals that don't belong here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. Walter exhaled, his jaw tightening. He didn't want to be part of this. But if he wasn't there, these men would shoot first and ask questions later. "We move out," James barked, spurring his horse forward. The others followed, disappearing into the snow-laden forest. The hunt begins. The group rode north, following the faint traces left behind by the tiger. Its massive paw prints were still visible in patches of undisturbed snow, leading deeper into the forest where the trees grew taller and the shadows stretched longer. As they rode, the silence between the men grew heavier. "You ever seen one before?" one of the younger hunters, Tom Grayson, asked. "A tiger?" James scoffed. "Hell no. But a big cat is a big cat. We bring it down like any other." Walter frowned. "Ain't like any other, James. Tigers are different. Smarter." James rolled his eyes. "It ain't magic, Walter. It's a beast, and we're putting it down." Walter fell quiet. Ahead, Nathan Bell, an older hunter with a thick gray beard, pulled his horse to a stop and raised a hand. "Hold up," he muttered. The group slowed. Up ahead, the trees opened into a small clearing, where something unusual caught their eyes. Bones, but not animal bones. James dismounted, rifle in hand, and stepped closer. A chill, not from the cold, but from something deeper, ran down his spine as he kicked the fresh snow away. It was the remains of a campfire, scattered ashes, remnants of old fabric, and bones small enough to belong to a child. What the hell is this? Tom muttered, stepping back. Walter's breath came slow. Somebody's been here. Not just the tiger. James clenched his jaw. Maybe that thing killed someone after all. But Walter wasn't convinced. He crouched near the remnants of the old fire, brushing his fingers over something half buried in the snow. A small, rusted locket. And when he pried it open, inside was a faded picture of a woman, smiling, her hands resting on a swollen belly. Walter's chest tightened. This ain't just a hunt, James. James scoffed. And what the hell do you think it is? Walter hesitated, but the thought was growing stronger in his mind. That tiger. It ain't just out here wandering. It's protecting something. A deep snarl cut through the air. The men stiffened. From the trees beyond the clearing, something moved. Large, powerful, deliberate. A flash of orange and black between the branches. The tiger was watching them. Savannah stood atop a ridge, her green eyes burning with intensity. Her ears flicked forward, her body poised in perfect stillness. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was waiting. James tightened his grip on the rifle, his fingers sliding toward the trigger. Walter stepped in front of him. "Hold on," he hissed. James scowled. "Walter, get the hell out of my way." But Walter stood his ground. "You kill her without knowing why she's here, and you might be making a damn big mistake." The tension was suffocating. The men gripped their weapons tighter, the horses shifting uneasily beneath them. The tiger stared, not at the men, but at Walter. And then, she did something none of them expected. She turned away. With slow, deliberate movements, Savannah retreated into the trees, disappearing into the shadows. The forest swallowed her whole. The growing divide. James was furious. "You let it go," he seethed, shoving Walter back. "You had a clear shot." Walter steadied himself, his face set like stone. "And what if you had shot her? What if we just killed the one thing keeping something else alive?" James clenched his jaw. "This ain't a damn fairy tale, Walter." "No," Walter said firmly. "It ain't." Nathan, the older hunter, cleared his throat. "Look, boys, maybe we go back. Think this through." James snapped. "You go back if you want," he barked. "But I'm not stopping till that thing is dead." Walter exhaled. "Then you're a bigger fool than I thought." James stepped closer, eyes dark. "You want to fight me on this, Evans?" Walter didn't move. "I'm gonna find her," James growled. "And when I do, I ain't hesitating like you." Then, without another word, he turned and stormed off into the trees. Tom and two other hunters followed him. Walter and Nathan stayed behind, watching the footprints in the snow. Nathan sighed. "What now?" Walter swallowed. "Now, we make damn sure they don't kill her before we find out the truth." Deep in the cave, Savannah curled her massive body around the babies, her tail wrapping protectively over them as the cold seeped in. Their tiny breaths were steady now, their bodies warm against her fur. She had seen the men. She had seen the danger coming, and she knew it wouldn't be long before they found her. She wasn't going to run. She was going to fight. For them. For her cubs. For the only thing she had left. The sun had begun its slow descent beyond the towering pines of Yellowstone, casting long, jagged shadows over the snow-covered ground. The cold had sharpened, biting at exposed skin, a constant reminder that the wilderness belonged to the unforgiving. Walter Evans moved carefully through the underbrush, his boots crunching softly against the frost-laden earth. Beside him, Nathan Bell walked with quiet steps, rifle slung over his back, though neither man seemed eager to use their weapons. "You really think she's hiding something?" Nathan asked in a low voice. Walter nodded, his jaw set. "I know she is." He pulled the locket from his pocket, flipping it open once more. The picture of the woman inside was faded, but her smile was unmistakable. This was buried near her tracks. "Ain't no tiger carrying jewelry." Nathan exhaled. "Damn shame if James finds her first." Walter didn't answer. He just quickened his pace. Deeper into the woods farther ahead, James Caldwell and his men were cutting through the snow-covered forest at a much faster speed, their boots sinking deep into the frost. "She's close," Tom Grayson muttered, scanning the trees. "Tracks are fresh." James didn't respond. His focus was locked ahead, where the footprints led toward a ridge, its rock face jagged and covered in a thick layer of frost. And then he saw it. An opening. A cave. James smirked. We got her. Inside the cave, Savannah's ears twitched at the sound of footsteps. She lifted her head slowly, her emerald eyes narrowing at the entrance of the cave. The babies, Jake, Emily, and Noah, stirred beside her, their tiny bodies still wrapped in the stolen blanket, their soft breaths barely audible against the cold air. She knew what was coming. She had smelled them on the wind, heard the crunch of their steps long before they arrived. Humans. Hunters. She let out a low, guttural growl, a warning. But it was too late. A silhouette appeared at the mouth of the cave, a rifle glinting in the dim light. James. For a moment, there was stillness, the kind that settled before a storm. His breath fogged in front of him, but his hands were steady as he raised his rifle. His eyes locked onto the massive tigress, her muscles coiled, her body positioned between him and something else. And then he saw them. The babies. For a split second, his brain refused to make sense of what he was seeing. What the hell? Before he could finish, Walter and Nathan burst through the trees behind him. James, don't shoot, Walter shouted, his voice sharp, urgent. James turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge them, but it was enough for Savannah to act. She lunged. A blur of orange and black moved faster than the human eye could track. James barely had time to react. He stumbled back, firing a shot that went wide, the bullet ricocheting off the cave walls. Savannah landed in front of him, her massive frame blocking the entrance, her lips peeled back in a feral snarl. James hit the ground, scrambling backward as her sharp teeth bared inches from his face. His rifle lay useless in the snow beside him. For the first time, James looked afraid. Jesus Christ, Tom muttered, raising his gun. Don't, Walter barked. Tom hesitated. Nathan took a slow step forward. James, listen to me, he said, his voice calm. She ain't attacking, da. James was breathing hard, eyes wide. The hell do you mean she ain't attacking? She nearly took my damn head off. She's protecting them, Walter said. He stepped forward carefully, his hands raised, not as a threat, but as someone trying to understand. James turned his head, his body stiff, and for the first time, he really saw what was behind the tiger. The three infants lay nestled in the moss-covered corner of the cave, alive, wrapped in nothing but the stolen blanket and Savannah's protective warmth. His breath caught. Walter kneeled near the cave's entrance, keeping his voice low, steady. She didn't kill those babies, James. She saved them. James swallowed hard, his mind racing. Who the hell leaves 3 newborns in the middle of a forest? Tom muttered, his rifle still half raised. Walter exhaled. I think we already know the answer. James clenched his jaw. Ethan Carter, the man who had disappeared after the death of his wife. The man who had been acting strange for weeks, avoiding town, drowning in grief. The man who no one had seen since last night. James's grip tightened on his useless rifle. You're telling me Ethan left him here to die? Walter's face was grim. I don't think he thought he had a choice. A heavy silence fell over the cave. Savannah hadn't moved. She was still between them and the children, her green eyes locked onto James. She wasn't snarling anymore, but she wasn't backing down either. She would die for them if she had to. James knew it. Walter took a slow breath. She's not the enemy here, James. James looked down at the rifle beside him. He could still do it. He could still pull the trigger, still end this whole thing before it got more complicated. And yet, his fingers didn't move. Something about the sight before him, the way the tiger stood guard, the way the babies rested so close to her, as if she were their mother, made his stomach twist in a way he couldn't explain. James had been raised to believe that nature didn't work like this. Predators killed. They didn't protect. And yet, this one did. He exhaled sharply, then finally lowered his gaze. What the hell do we do now? Walter stood. We take him back. James shook his head. You really think she's gonna let us take him? Walter turned to Savannah, their eyes meeting. She didn't move, but there was something in her gaze, a recognition, an unspoken understanding. Walter took a step forward, then another. He moved slow, deliberately, until he was near the infants. He kneeled, careful not to make any sudden moves, and gently lifted Emily into his arms. Savannah's ears flicked, but she let him. James watched in stunned silence as Nathan followed, lifting Jake and Noah carefully. They stood, holding the children, as Savannah sat back on her haunches. She didn't snarl. She didn't attack. She watched. Walter swallowed. She knew this wasn't forever. James exhaled, rubbing his temples. Jesus. Walter glanced down at the tiny baby in his arms, her small fingers curling around his sleeve. Then, he turned to Savannah, giving her a final nod of respect. You did good, girl. And with that, they carried the children out of the cave. Behind them, Savannah watched as her cubs disappeared into the fading light. Her job was done. For now, the ride back to town was slow, weighed down by the silence of those carrying the 3 infants through the snow-covered forest. Walter Evans, his arms cradling little Emily, glanced down at the baby girl, her tiny breath warming the fabric of his coat. Nathan Bell rode beside him, holding Jake, while Tom Grayson carried Noah, the smallest of the 3. Behind them, James Caldwell remained quiet. His horse moved steadily, but his mind was in turmoil. He had come into these woods prepared to kill a beast. Instead, he had witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible. A predator protecting prey. A tiger saving human children. And worse yet, he hadn't pulled the trigger. James had spent his whole life seeing the world in black and white. Animals followed their instincts. Men did what had to be done. But what he saw in that cave, that tiger standing over those kids like she was one of them, had rattled him to his core. This ain't right, he muttered under his breath. Walter looked over. What ain't? James gritted his teeth. This whole damn thing. You mean the part where a tiger saved 3 babies after their father left him to die? Walter said flatly. James shot him a glare. I mean the part where we just left a wild animal in the woods after she got a taste for taking care of human young. He ran a hand down his face. What happens when she finds another kid? Another family? She gonna go looking for him now? Walter exhaled slowly. She did what we were supposed to do, James. James let out a bitter chuckle. And that don't scare the hell out of you? Walter looked back down at Emily, then at James. No, he said simply. James fell silent. But he was scared. Not of the tiger. Not of what had happened. But of what it meant. Back in town. The divided community by the time they reached Gardner, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of orange and violet. Word had spread fast. 3 abandoned babies had been found alive in the wilderness. And the town had questions. By the time Walter and the others rode up to Miller's General Store, nearly half the town had gathered. Townsfolk, bundled against the cold, murmured in hushed voices, their faces a mix of curiosity, relief, and confusion. Clara Evans was the first to rush forward. Oh my God, she breathed. Her hands clasped over her chest as she saw the bundled infants. Are they? They're fine, Walter assured her, dismounting carefully. Cold, hungry, but fine. Clara reached out, gently touching Emily's tiny hand, her eyes welling with tears. But then the question started. Where the hell did they come from? Who abandoned him? How'd they survive the cold? And finally, what does the tiger have to do with this? The crowd fell into tense silence. Margaret Dawson stepped forward, her sharp eyes moving between Walter and James. You saw it, didn't you? She asked, her voice calm but pointed. Walter nodded. We did. A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. James inhaled sharply, then spoke first. That thing. He hesitated, shaking his head. That tiger ain't normal. Someone gasped. You mean it tried to attack you? A man from the back asked. James clenched his jaw. He could have lied. He could have said yes, told them exactly what they wanted to hear. But the truth wouldn't leave him. No, he admitted, voice tight. She was protecting him. The crowd froze. A hush fell over the town square, eyes widening, disbelief washing over the faces of dozens of people. You're telling me, Reverend Cole finally said, stepping forward, that a tiger, a predator, was, what? Taking care of these children? His tone dripped with skepticism. Walter held his ground. That's exactly what I'm telling you. The murmuring grew louder. That's unnatural, someone muttered. God's creatures don't act that way, another man added. You sure it wasn't just keeping them alive for a later meal? Walter's patience snapped. Does this look like she was waiting to eat him? He said, his voice rising as he lifted Emily slightly. The baby stirred, her tiny face pressing into his coat, utterly at peace. She kept him warm. She fed him. She protected him when their own damn father left him to die. Silence. Then, a sharp gasp from the crowd. Wait, who left them? Walter exhaled, knowing what had to come next. Ethan Carter. The shock was immediate. You're lying, someone muttered. But Margaret Dawson stepped forward. No, he's not. All eyes turned to her. Margaret's face was unreadable, but her voice was clear. I suspected something was wrong when Lena Carter died, she said. Ethan never came back after the burial. And now we know why. She turned, looking at the babies in the men's arms. Because these children were never supposed to come home. The crowd erupted. That bastard left his own flesh and blood in the wild? He should be hanged. Where is he now? No one had an answer. But one thing was clear. The town had found its villain. And the tiger? She had become something else entirely. Margaret's final words. Margaret Dawson approached Walter, her eyes softening as she looked down at the babies. You know what this means, don't you? Walter nodded. Yeah. The tiger's part of the story now, she whispered. Whether the town likes it or not. Walter looked over at James, who hadn't said another word. His rifle was still slung over his shoulder, but for the first time since he had come back from the woods, he didn't seem so certain about what should be done. Margaret's voice lowered even further. You can feel it, can't you? She said. Walter exhaled slowly. He could. The town had a choice to make. Would they see the tiger as a savior? Or would they hunt the only creature that had done what no human had? Margaret sighed, turning her gaze toward the darkened forest beyond the town. They're going to start calling her something soon, she murmured. Walter frowned. What? Margaret's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. The tigress, mother. Walter swallowed, looking down at Emily once more. The baby stirred, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The storm wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The tension in Gardner had thickened like the approaching winter storm. The discovery of the 3 infants had shaken the town to its core, and the revelation that a tiger had protected them instead of killing them had only deepened the divide. By the following morning, the townsfolk were split into 2 factions. On one side, those who saw the tiger as a miracle, an inexplicable force that had intervened when no human had. Led by Margaret Dawson and a handful of others, they believed Savannah's actions were proof that nature was more than just survival. It was protection, too. On the other side, James Caldwell and his supporters were not convinced. To them, a wild animal could never be trusted, no matter what it had done. If the tiger remained in the forest near town, there would always be a risk. James had never been one to sit around and let things happen. So that morning, as the first hints of daylight crept through the thick clouds, he and his men rode out, guns loaded, knives sharpened, and tracks fresh in the snow. Their mission was simple: find the tiger, kill it, end this before it became something more. The Forest Awakens. Walter Evans had been up before dawn, his gut telling him something was wrong. The moment he stepped outside and saw the empty saddles at the stables, he knew. They had gone after her. Nathan Bell met him near the general store, his expression grim. James ain't wasting time. Walter exhaled. We gotta get ahead of him. Nathan nodded. Margaret's coming too. She says we ain't letting them write this story alone. Walter wasn't sure what that meant, but he didn't argue. Minutes later, he, Nathan, and Margaret were on horseback, riding into the wilderness before it was too late. The snow was fresh, and the tracks were clear. Savannah had moved during the night, heading deeper into the forest, as if she had sensed the danger coming. James and his men rode hard, following her trail through the thick pines. Tom Grayson pulled his horse to a halt. She's moving faster than we thought, he muttered, pointing ahead. She ain't settin' up nowhere. James scowled. That means she knows we're comin', da. Think she'll run? Another hunter asked. James didn't answer. He didn't want her to run. He wanted this to be over. Suddenly, a sound. A low, guttural growl. James froze, his heart hammering. He turned his head, scanning the trees. The forest was too quiet. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. And then, a flash of orange. Savannah moved like a ghost through the snow, her massive paws making barely a sound. She wasn't running. She was stalking. James gripped his rifle. She's here. The hunters spread out, forming a loose circle, their weapons raised, their breath coming out in visible clouds. Then, from behind a fallen log, Savannah emerged. Her green eyes burned, her ears flattened. But she wasn't attacking. She was waiting. A challenge. James tightened his grip on the rifle, his pulse racing. "You ain't walking out of here this time," he muttered. But before he could fire, a voice rang out. "James, don't." James turned his head sharply to see Walter, Nathan, and Margaret riding toward them at full speed. Walter leapt from his horse, landing in the snow between James and Savannah. James cursed. "Get the hell out of the way, Walter." Walter shook his head. "You shoot her, and this whole town's gonna live with that mistake." James's face twisted. "She's a goddamn tiger, Walter. I don't care what she did. She don't belong here." Walter exhaled. "Maybe she don't, but she saved those kids. And you know damn well she could have killed you in that cave. But she didn't." James's jaw clenched. He knew, and that was what scared him the most. "Look around, James," Walter continued. "She ain't attacking us. She ain't running. She's just standing here." James's fingers twitched on the trigger. Then, Savannah did something no one expected. She lowered herself, her muscles relaxing, her tail curling around her massive paws. A sign of submission. Walter's heart skipped. James stared, something unreadable in his expression. Margaret stepped forward, her voice quiet. "She's giving you the choice, James." A long silence fell. James inhaled sharply. He could feel every eye on him, waiting, judging. He could end it right now. Or he could let go. His hands trembled. Then, slowly, he lowered his rifle. "She goes," he muttered. "She never comes back." Walter nodded. Savannah's green eyes flickered between them. And then, she turned and disappeared into the trees. Gone. Free. James exhaled heavily, his whole body tired. He turned away, his jaw tight. "This ain't over," he muttered, mounting his horse. Walter watched him ride away, knowing that for him, maybe it never would be. But Savannah had survived. And that, for now, was enough. Back in town, a new legend is born by nightfall. Word had spread. James Caldwell and his men had let the tiger go. The town was buzzing with questions, with stories that would change with every retelling. Some would say the tiger was a guardian spirit, sent by something greater to protect those children. Others would whisper that she was a monster spared by foolish men, destined to return one day. But in the hearts of those who knew the truth, Savannah had become something else entirely. She was no longer just a predator. She was no longer just a wild animal. She was the tigress mother, a creature of the wilderness, a ghost in the trees, a legend whispered under the moonlight. Some say that, on cold winter nights, when the wind howls through the forest and the snow glows under the moon, you can still see her eyes, watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, protecting something else. Because in the end, she had never been the monster. She had been the savior. Winter's grip tightened over Gardiner, the snow now thick on the rooftops, the chimneys exhaling steady trails of smoke into the bitter sky. The town had been forever changed by what had happened in the woods. The three infants, Jake, Emily, and Noah, had been saved, but their fate remained uncertain. Who would raise them? And more importantly, what would the town do about the tiger? The question hung over every conversation, every whispered discussion in the general store, every uneasy glance toward the mountains. Would she return? Would she hunt? Or had she truly just been a guardian of the lost? A town meeting was called, and for the first time in years, every single person showed up. The town meeting the church had never been so full. Men, women, elders, and children crowded into the pews, bundled in thick coats, their breath still visible in the cold air. The room was tense, filled with voices that overlapped, emotions that simmered just beneath the surface. Walter Evans, Nathan Bell, Margaret Dawson, and Clara Evans sat near the front, the three infants cradled carefully in blankets, their tiny faces peeking out, oblivious to the weight of the moment. At the head of the room stood James Caldwell, his presence alone enough to make people listen. Though he had lowered his rifle in the forest, his position in town as a hunter, a leader, a man of action was still intact. He cleared his throat. "We all know why we're here," he said. "The tiger, a damn tiger, has been living in our woods. And not just that. She's been," he hesitated, struggling with the words. "She's been protecting these kids." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Now, I know that don't sit right with some of you," James continued, "but we gotta decide what we do next. Do we let that thing go? Do we hunt it down before it decides it ain't done with us yet? That tiger saved those babies." "James," Walter cut in, his voice steady but firm. "Ain't no way around that." James let out a sharp breath. "And what happens when she comes back? When she ain't protecting anymore?" Margaret leaned forward on her cane, her voice clear despite her age. "What happens if she never comes back at all?" The room fell silent. Walter turned toward the pews. "None of us ever seen nothing like that before. A wild animal, a predator, choose sin to protect instead of kill. And we could go round and round trying to make sense of it, but it won't change what happened." A few nods, some hesitation. Then, "What about the children?" A voice rang out from the back. All eyes turned toward the speaker, Sarah Thompson, a local woman who had lost her own child in childbirth years ago. "We've been so caught up in that tiger that no one's asked the real question," she said, her voice strong but trembling. "Who's going to take care of them?" Walter glanced down at Emily, who had curled a tiny fist around his sleeve. "We figure that out together," he said simply. A murmur of agreement spread through the room. Clara stood. "They ain't got no parents no more," she said. "But that don't mean they gotta be alone. I say the town raises 'em." Surprised murmurs. A few shocked glances. Then, slowly, heads began to nod. "They deserve a home," Margaret added. "And we'll make sure they get one," Nathan agreed. James exhaled. He was outnumbered, and he knew it. Finally, after a long pause, he nodded once. "The town raises 'em," he muttered. "Fine." He paused. "But the tiger stays out there. And if she ever comes back—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Everyone knew what he meant. A new beginning. By the time the meeting ended, the town had made its decision. The three infants, once abandoned in the forest, would never be abandoned again. Over the following weeks, families took turns caring for them, providing food, warmth, and love. Emily, Jake, and Noah would never have just one home. They would have a town. As for Savannah, she was gone. No one saw her in the following days, not even Walter, who rode through the woods more than once, searching for a flash of orange in the trees. But the